So now we have to deal with factoring the difference of squares. So let's do our recall. When we had something like x minus 2y times x plus 2y, where you had the same thing in the front and the back, it's just the signs were different in the parentheses. When we multiplied it out, the two middle pieces canceled each other out, knocked each other out, and became 0. So we were left with the first one squared minus the second one squared. This is now what we have to factor in reverse. So for our difference of two squares, that's when we have a binomial where you have different signs. So one's a plus, one's a minus. And we can write it as some whole thing squared minus some other whole thing squared. If that's the case, we're going to be able to factor it. Whatever you can figure out that's being squared, that's what you're going to write in the front parentheses. Whatever's being squared, you're going to write in the back parentheses, and you're going to alternate the signs. And I'm going to leave that for you to write those steps down. Okay? So let's go through our examples. 49a squared minus 16b to the fourth, and the direction says to factor. So the first thing I'm going to notice is that if I compare the 49a squared to the minus 16b to the fourth, I do not have something in common. There's no common factor. That's still going to be my first step. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to count my terms, and I see that there's two terms. So now I'm going to look and check to see if it follows that difference of squares. So I need to have some whole thing squared minus some other whole thing squared. My minus sign is already in the middle, so that's okay. Now I have to figure out what's being squared. So I'm going to write my parentheses with my square on it and my minus in the middle. Now, 49, if I take the square root of 49, I get a 7. So my 7's being squared up front in terms of my number. Now I have to think about the variable. Square root of 49 gave me that. For my variable, if I take that a, and if I wanted to rewrite it with the parentheses on the outside, I would have to do the 2 that they gave me divided by the 2 that I want to put on the outside, and I would get a 1. Because 1 times 2 will give me my 2. 1 times 2 gives me my 2. So that means anytime I want to figure out what's being squared, the key to it is dividing by 2. If I take the exponent, and this is just for the exponent that they give me, and divide it by 2, that'll tell me my exponent to use in this parentheses. Now, if it doesn't come out as a whole number, then you know we can't do it. Or we're not going to do it. So 2 goes into the 2 that we were given one time. So that's where I'm going to get my A from. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to take a look at the back one. 16, that's a plain number. So I'm going to take the square root of 16 to figure out that that's a 4. Then for that b to the fourth, 4 is an exponent. So I'm going to take the 4 and I'm going to divide it by 2 to get a 2. And that 2 that I'm getting is my exponent on my b now. Now that I've figured out what's being squared, I'm in my home stretch. I write my 2 parentheses. 7a was being squared up front, so I write a 7a in the front of both of them. 4b squared is what's being squared in the back. I write a 4b squared in the back of both of them. Then I alternate my signs. What I'm supposed to do from here is to check it and make certain that I don't have something else that I can then do this exact same process on. So if I look at the 7a plus 4b squared, I have a binomial, but I don't have two different signs, so I can't do anything with that. If I then turn around and look at the 7a minus 4b squared, I have a binomial, but I can't square something to get that 7a. Not a nice pretty whole number. Okay? Square root of 7 doesn't give me a nice pretty whole number. So, I'm done. This ends up being my final answer. Let's look at the second example. I have a binomial. I have two terms. So I'm looking at what we're doing for this tutorial. I don't have a common factor, but it's not where I can easily write it in that something squared minus something else squared format. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite it. Then I'm going to figure out what's being squared. Well, the 1 is easy. 1 squared will give me a 1. 9, if I take the square root of 9, that'll give me a 3. And if I divide that 6 exponent by 2, it'll give me a 3 as well. So see, I just figured it out in my head, and I just wrote it down here so you see it matches the format. So there I added some extra notes on there for you. So 1 is being squared up front, so I write a 1 up front in both parentheses. 3y cubed is the back, so I write a 3y cubed in the back. Alternate the signs. This is an acceptable answer. Another way that we could have worked the problem, remember how we said you have to factor out a negative when that negative's up front? We could have factored out a negative to where in parentheses we would have had a 9y to the 6 minus 1. Then we figure out what's being squared. Three y cubed being squared up front, so I write it in the front of both parentheses. 1's being squared in the back, I write it in the back of both parentheses, and I alternate my signs. And the negative that we factored out, I just carried down. This is another way to write that answer. And I neglected to mention that we needed to check it to make certain we couldn't factor it again. When there's a plus in that binomial, you're done. Actually, sometimes there is another way to factor it, but we're not learning it. So if there's a plus inside that, in there with that binomial, we are done. On this second parentheses with the 3y cubed minus 1, there's my minus sign I need. But I can't square something to get a 3. And if I take my 3 exponent and divide it by 2, I get a fraction. So it's not going to work. Let's look at two more examples. On this third example, 49a squared, I can figure out what's being squared there. The 16b to the 4th, we can figure out what's being squared there. We already did that. That was our first example. But what messes us up on this one is that there's a plus sign in the middle. So I don't have two different signs in front of the two terms. They're both positive. So we are not going to be able to do anything with that, and we're going to write prime. On the next example, the 4x squared part, I can figure out what's being squared on that one. The 9y cubed is the one that's giving me a problem. I have the two different signs, but this y cubed booger is going to mess me up. Because if I take the exponent of 3 and divide by 2, that's not going to give me a nice pretty whole number. That doesn't work. So that's the most we can do with it. So we're going to write prime. Just to be fully transparent, sometimes these problems aren't necessarily prime. It's just that we don't know any other technique, so we're writing prime.